Ancient and Modern Britons, book by David MacRitchie. Book 1, Chapter 1, Contents, Fair Whites and Dark Whites. The Australoid Craniological Testimony Ugrians and Iberians, a Sanner de. Red Indian Thur. Theory, Stone Circles and Their Makers, Distribution of the White Races, Early Migrations and British Types. Whoever has gone into one of our antiquarian museums and glanced with some curiosity, and perhaps with growing interest, at the withered fragments of canoes preserved from total decay by the peat out of which they were dug, at the stone heads of weapons whose handles have rotted long ago, at the flint knives and arrowheads, at the sun-dried pottery, at the gaudy beads of amber or of coloured glass, at the combs and ornaments curiously carved out of bone, and at all such other relics of a remote past, has soon, in all likelihood, found himself speculating upon the nature of the people who made and used these things. The things themselves are plainly allied to the weapons and ornaments of existing savage races, and we know that the people vaguely spoken of as ancient Britons, to whom these articles are attributed, were themselves allied to such races by community of custom. They wore little or no clothing, they tattooed their bodies and faces, they painted themselves blue or green, and some tribes smeared themselves over with iron ore. Some of them are stated to have been cannibals. Could all such resemblances have existed if the races themselves, however far separated now, had no tall belonged to a common stock? Can there be community of custom, apparent in most minute details, without there being community of blood? Surely not. Such a practice as cannibalism might easily exist among nations who had lived apart from each other since the making of the world. Similarity of design in weapons, ornaments, and pottery might, with less probability, belong to unconnected races. But there can be no reasonable explanation of the community of such an unnatural custom as tattooing the skin except this one, that the races amongst whom it was and is in use have derived it from a common original, however distant in time the point of union may be. But to this it may be objected. The ancient Britons were my ancestors, and the tattooed races of that day were dark-complexioned men. I am a white man. How could my ancestors be anything but white men too? The question suggests many counter-questions. Who are you? Were your ancestors, ancient Britons? What are the physical qualifications belonging to the white man, and are you fully entitled to be so described? Such counter-questions, or some of them, are not so easily answered as may at first appear. The average modern Briton would be somewhat surprised and confused if he were required to give the names of all his progenitors of the reign of Queen Anne, and not one could produce a pedigree that would show to the satisfaction of critical antiquaries the name and race of every ancestor and ancestress living at the date of the Norman conquest. The limit might safely be placed some centuries nearer our own time, but the Norman conquest will do. And as for the question of complexion and physical traits, it is becoming more apparent every day that we are a mixed race, though most of us seldom realize the full force of the words, and many of us are unacquainted with the heterogeneous nature of the mixture. It will be well to ascertain the opinions on this subject arrived at by men of science. Professor Huxley states in his remarks relative to his map showing the distribution of the chief modifications of mankind, published in the Journal of the Ethnological Society of London, Volume 2, Issue 4, that the inhabitants of the British Islands are a blending of two great types, the zanthocroid and the melanochroi. The first division is composed of the fair whites, who are described as of tall stature, having the skin almost colourless and so delicate that the blood really shows through it. The eyes are blue or grey, the hair light ranging from straw colour to red or chestnut, the beard and body hair abundant. The skull presents all varieties of forms, from extreme dolichocephaly to extreme brachycephaly. That is, that this class includes men with very long and very short heads. The second type is that of the dark whites, of which he says, under its best form this type is exhibited by many Irishmen, Welshmen and Bretons, by Spaniards, South Italians, Greeks, Armenians, Arabs and high-caste Brahmins, A man of this group may, in point of physical beauty and intellectual energy, be the equal of the best of the zanthocroid, but he presents a great contrast, in other respects, to the latter type, for the skin, though clear and transparent, is of a more or less brown hue, deepening to olive oil, the hair fine and wavy, is black, and the eyes are of a like hue. The average stature, however, is ordinarily lower than in the xanthochroic type, and the make of the frame is usually lighter. I am much disposed to think that the melanochroi are the result of an intermixture between the xanthochroid and the australoid. When one learns that the people who are understood to represent the oldest known inhabitants of our islands are thus classified under a denomination which covers the descendants of a supposed blending of fair whites and australoid, one naturally inquires further as to the position and characteristics of these australoid. On looking at the map referred to, it is seen that they consist of the whole aboriginal population of Australia, of the natives of interior India, the Deccan, for example, and of the inhabitants of Middle and Upper Egypt, the whole area, indeed, that is occupied by the descendants of the ancient Egyptians. Mr. Huxley depicts the australoid in the following words. The males of this type are commonly of fair stature, with well-developed torso and arms, but relatively and absolutely slender legs. The colour of the skin is some shade of chocolate brown, and the eyes arc very dark brown or black. The hair is usually raven black, fine and silky in texture, and it is never woolly but usually wavy and tolerably long. The beard is sometimes well developed, as is the hair upon the body and the eyebrows. The Australians are invariably dolichocephalic, the cranial index rarely exceeding 75 or 76, and often not amounting to more than 71 or 72. The brow ridges are strong and prominent, though the frontal sinuses are in general very small or absent. The normal occipitalis is usually sharply pentagonal. The nose is broad rather than flat. The jaws are heavy, and the lips remarkably coarse and flexible. There is usually strongly marked alveolar prognathism, the projection of the upper jaw in front of the face. The teeth are large and the fangs usually stronger and more distinctly marked than in any other forms of mankind. As regards those of this group to be found in India, he says, the only people out of Australia who present the chief characteristics of the Australians in a well-marked form are the so-called hill tribes who inhabit the interior of the Deccan, in Hindostan. An ordinary coolie, that is a low-wage labourer, typically of Indian or Chinese descent and darker complexion, would pass very well for an Australian, though he is ordinarily less coarse in skull and jaw. As I have mentioned, he also includes the descendant of the ancient Egyptian under this heading. For although the Egyptian has been much modified by civilization and probably by admixture, he still retains the dark skin, the black, silky, wavy hair, the long skull, the fleshy lips, and broad also of the nose, which we know distinguished his remote ancestors, and which cause both him and them to approach the Australian Ndasyu more clearly than they do any other form of mankind. The same eminent authority states in another place, percent, I shall be inclined to look among the Papuan races of New Guinea and New Holland for the nearest allies of men to whom the shell mounds of Europe once belonged. Of these people he speaks in the following terms. Quoted from Ethnological Society's journal page, 121, volume 2, issue number 2. In the Andaman Islands, in the peninsula of Malacca, in the Philippines, in the islands which stretch from Wallace's Line eastward and southward, nearly parallel with the east coast of Australia, to New Caledonia, and finally in Tasmania, men with dark skins and woolly hair occur who constitute a special modification of the Negroid type, the Negritos. Footnote. I find that the plain English for this scientific term is the shape of the occipital outline, the skull being viewed from behind. Only the Andamans have presented skulls approaching or exceeding an index of 80, or the Negritos, the crania of which have been examined, are dolichocephalic, but the skulls of the eastern and southern Negritos present, as I have mentioned, a remarkable approximation to the australoid type, and differ notably from the ordinary African Negroes in the great brow ridges and the pentagonal norma occipitalis. That is the back of the skull. The best known and the most typical of these eastern Negritos are the inhabitants of Tasmania and of New Caledonia, and those of the islands of Torres Straits and of New Guinea. In the outlying islands to the eastward, especially in the Fijis, the Negritos have certainly undergone considerable intermixture with the Polynesians, and it seems probable that a similar crossing with Malays may have occurred in New Guinea. The now extinct Tasmanians, who belong to the most typical division of the eastern Negritos, have been particularly described by Mr. James Bonwick, FRGS, in his Last of the Tasmanians, the contents of which book are thus summarized in the Ethnological Society's journal. The Tasmanians are described as having been a people of moderate stature and, compared with the Australians, stout and robust. The skin was of a dark brown colour, or nearly black, and was ornamented with scars and cuts upon the chest, the shoulders, and the thighs, while the entire body was covered with a mixture of grease and red ochre, which was also liberally applied to the hair. It is notable that certain stone circles, and piles of stones evidently of human erection, have been found in the interior of the island. The importance of studying this Tasmanian section of the Australoid division is very apparent. Not only does Mr. Huxley argue from the appearance of certain existing Britons that they represent, in a degree, a British race of Australoid type, but there are visible and tangible proofs of the previous existence in our island of such a people. These proofs are craniological. We know, says the writer of a small pamphlet on this subject, that the first inhabitants of Britain, let us say, certain tribes of ancient Britons, and more especially those of the northern parts, were craniologically of a type approaching to the Negro, or to the Australian race. In the autumn of 1865, Mr. Samuel Laing discovered a quantity of human remains near Cais, in the county of Caithness, Scotland. They were submitted by him to Professor Huxley, whose notes on these remains point markedly to such a conclusion. The skulls found in chambered mounds in Great Britain, and which Dr. Daniel Wilson refers to as being those of the earliest race, are generally long and narrow-shaped, and prove beyond doubt that the race to which they belonged was absolutely at that time, however much development might take place afterwards, of the very lowest type of humanity. The grounds for the assertion that the Australioid type belonged, more especially, to the northern parts of the island are not given in the pamphlet just quoted from, but the presence of that family in the Caithness district is shown most clearly by the Keith skulls. Their era does not seem to be agreed upon, and indeed the length of the epochs of prehistoric incidents is somewhat bewildering, by reason of the conflicting conclusions arrived at by various savants and their followers, some of whom manipulate their hundreds of thousands of years as calmly and as easily as an ordinary man does his centuries. But in dealing with those stone folk and troglodytes, one must remember that both exist at the present day, side by side with higher races, and that consequently their era in Britain may not be so very remote after all. In his remarks upon the aborigines of Tasmania, Mr. Bonwick refers more than once to their kinship, structurally, with certain prehistoric Europeans. Mr. Carter Blake, a competent judge, describes a skull from a cyst in Uist Island of Scotland as of an overtly dolichocephalic form, and having a narrow forehead with great projecting brow, like the Tasmanian. Mr. Samuel Laing, in his interesting revelations of the Caithness cysts, imagines the earliest inhabitants of North Britain were cumbocephalic, boat-headed, approaching to a Negroid or Australian, rather than to a Mongol or Arctic type. Again, he writes, "This tribes of aboriginal Britons must have more closely resembled the Australian or Tasmanian than the Laplander or Eskimo." Dr. Pruner Bay, to make a final extract from Mr. Bonwick's book, compares our southern blacks with the prehistoric cavemen. We find that there has been a constant move in one direction at least, a gradual encroachment by the Celtic, Germanic and Slavic races upon the humbler races on their frontiers, and these latter invariably of the Ugrian family. The Basques in Spain are now penned in a small corner of their ancient patrimony in the time of the Romans. The families of both Finnish and Lapps, now known as the Sami tribe, have been pushed back in Scandinavia to a very small portion of their ancient holding. In Livonia, in Estonia, and in 3/4 of European Russia, the Ugrians were, even in the nth century, the preponderating population. Proofs are now accumulating that before the Christian era this process of displacement was taking place even at a greater rate, the area to be occupied having been much more fertile and inviting. I have attempted to show, in a paper read before the British Association, that a very great element in the Celtic language is Ugrian, and I believe the same to be true of the Latin and Greek. Of the presence of a large Turanian admixture among the ancient Romans, which Dr. Hyde Clark exerts himself to prove, I entertain not the slightest doubt, says Mr. Carl Blind in the Contemporary Review of September 1SS1. He continues with, the German-speaking races, I believe, have occupied Central Europe since the 3rd century BC. The Celts and the Slavs arrived sometime in the 9th century, and the Indo-European element of Italy and Greece arrived sometime the 10th or 9th centuries respectively. And, if this be, then we get a very recent date comparatively for the period when the Basques in Spain and the Finns in Sweden, now mere wrecks and waifs, that is, a homeless, neglected or abandoned person, especially of children, of their original population, and each family was close neighbours, and one homogeneous people occupied, if not a ring round the world, at least one reaching from Britain to Kamskatka, when Europe was overrun by fishermen and hunters, such as we find in Siberia, where we ought to go if we are to study the religion, the manners and government of the so-called stone folk. The Mongoloid families, one of the chief of which is the Ugrian, are thus spoken of by Professor Huxley in his remarks on the distribution of mankind. An enormous area, which lies mainly to the east of a line drawn from Lapland to Sami, is peopled for the most part by men who are short and squat, with the skin of a yellow-brown colour, the eyes and hair black, and the latter straight, coarse, and scanty on the body and face, but long on the scalp. They are strongly brachycephalic, the skull being usually devoid of prominent brow ridges, while the nose is flat and small, and the eyes are oblique. The Malays proper, and, I suspect, the indigenous people of the Philippines, who are not negritos, fall under the same general definition. The Vogels, a division of that race, are pictured by Dr. Latham in similar terms. Their hair is black or brown, seldom yellow or red, the beard scanty, the skin glabrous and pale, the cheekbones project, the face broad and flat, and Mr. Howarth makes the following remarks upon the ancient Hungarians, Ungari, or Ugrians. They are described, he says, as living by fishing and hunting and as fighting with bows and arrows. The notary of Bela tells us they had no cities nor fixed houses, nor did they live upon the produce of agriculture, but on flesh and fish. Their young men were continually hunting, and thus it happened that even in his day the Hungarians were the most renowned hunters. This tallies well with what we have said of the affinities of the Hungarians with the Vogues. Leo has furnished Gibbon with material for some sonorous phrases in his description of the Hungarians. Their tents were of leather, their garments of fur, they shaved their hair, and scarified their faces. In speech they were slow, in action prompt, in treaty perfidious. The Spanish Basques, in the opinion of the writer on whom we have just relied, are among the purest representatives of this ancient Ugrian type. Now this is a little confusing, for these Basques are also held to represent the Iberians, and while the Ugrians are described as a round-headed folk, the skulls of the people called Iberians are long or oval. Let us hear what is said about those Iberians. To the question, who are the Iberians, it is impossible to give a satisfactory answer in the form of a concise definition. Historical, numismatic, linguistic, and anthropological evidences have been brought to bear on the problem of their affinity, and the result is, on the whole, not so much light as darkness visible. This is not encouraging to an inquirer, but one learns from the same source that scientific men, on the whole, are pretty unanimous as to certain leading beliefs. Humboldt gave out his hypothesis in 1821, of which the main arguments were these: that the Iberians were one great people, speaking a distinct language of their own, that they were to be found in Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, in southern France, and even in the British Isles, and that the Basques of the present day were the distinctly recognizable remnants of the race which had elsewhere been expelled or absorbed. It is stated that the great current of ethnographical speculation still flows in the direction indicated by Humboldt, though it breaks up into a number of distinct channels. The anthropological researches of Broca, Thurnam, and Davies, Huxley, Busk, Virchow, Toubineau, and others have proved the existence in Europe of a Neolithic race, small of stature, with long or oval skulls, and accustomed to bury their dead in tombs. Their remains have been found in Belgium and France, in Britain, Germany, and Denmark, as well as in Spain, but they bear a closer resemblance to the Basques than to any other living people. This Neolithic race has consequently been identified with the Basques and the Iberians, and extreme exponents of the theory do not hesitate to speak of the Iberian ancestors of the people of England, recognizing the racial characteristics in the Asmall swarthy Welshman, the Asmall dark Highlander, and the black Celts to the west of the Shannon, as well as in the typical inhabitants of Aquitania and Brittany. Some investigators go even further. M. Darbois de Jubainville, for example, regards the Iberians as the descendants of the Atlantes, i.e. the hypothetical inhabitants of Plato's great western isle, the Atlantis, and maintains that in Europe they possessed Spain, Gaul, Italy, and the British Isles, penetrated into the Balkan Peninsula, and occupied a part of northern Africa, Corsica, and Sardinia. Thus we see that the Basques, or Euskas, when looked at as Ugrians, are brachycephalic, or round-headed, and sallow rather than tawny in complexion. As Iberians they are dolichal or combucephalic, and of swarthy hue. According to the one conjecture, they are nearer the Eskimo than the Tasmanian. According to the other, they are more Australoid than Mongoloid. The points which they share in common, viewed from either position, are their short stature and black hair and eyes. The probability is that the Ugrians were a greatly mixed people, and that they constituted a meeting ground for those two great human families whose qualities they possess in varying degrees. Indeed, so far as nomenclature goes, there is evidence of their hybrid character. There were Cherny Ugri or black Ugri, as well as white, black Khazars and white Khazars, black Bulgarians and white Bulgarians, all of whom belong to this classification of Ungari, Ugri, or Ogors. But this evidence is so slight as to be little more than conjecture, since it is not clear whether the terms white and black, as thus used, really bore reference to the complexions of those various races. And besides, if they did so, the fact would suggest many questions which it is convenient to shelve, questions reflecting upon the ancestry of the zanthocroid, or fair whites. At present, and chiefly, our purpose is to consider those peoples whose complexions have been pretty well ascertained to be coloured. In addition to the black or brown and yellow races already spoken of as prehistoric Europeans, there is a theory that a copper-coloured race, closely akin to some branches of American Indians, once inhabited Europe, or rather the southern parts of Europe and North Africa. Proofs of this are said to be visible in the complexion of the modern Copts, which is reddish, and of the Nubians, who are described as of a deep red colour, with nothing of the Negro in their profile and with oval faces. This theory has been started by an Italian archaeologist named Generelli, and may be seen at length in the Journal of the Anthropological Institute. Its leading points are thus summarized. In support of the hypothesis of kinship between the red races of Europe and America, Generelli adduces I. The existence of pyramids in Egypt, America, and Etruria. B. Of labyrinths in Egypt, America, and Etruria. C. Of the title Children of the Sun, born both by the Incas and the Pharaohs. D. Of mummies in Egypt and America, and images of mummies in Etruria. E. of hieroglyphic languages in Egypt and America, F of languages having a similar structure in America, Iberia, and Etruria. Humboldt thought there were affinities between the Basque and Etruscan, G of the Nile in Egypt and a Nile region in Guatemala, from the Cordillera of Soconusco, southwest corner of the Andes Mountains, to the Pacific, and finally H of canopies and sacrificial vases in Egypt, Mexico, Yucatan, and Peru, with names similar to the deities they represent, 1, and of the root atl, which in its original signification he asserts to belong not to the European but to the American languages. Generelli further supports his theory by the assertion that animals of American origin, unknown to Africa, are to be found among the Egyptian hieroglyphics and in the paintings or sculptures on the vases and monuments of Etruria. He also points to evidence of the existence in Italy of races which were neither Aryan nor Semitic, under the various names of Aborigines, Siculi, Liguri, Umbri, etc., and he also suggests that the Phoenicians were of this copper-coloured hue. It is perhaps scarcely correct to describe this as a third division of dark-skinned people, for Signor Generelli's red is not very different from Professor Huxley's chocolate brown. The colours ascribed by each to the ancient Egyptians. The connection between this last theory and the consideration of ancient Britons becomes apparent when one remembers that not only are these people allied to the Egyptians as being both Australoid, but there is also a legend that the Scots are of Egyptian descent, while of the Phoenician intercourse with Britain there is no doubt. However, the red colour of the Phoenicians seems only a suggestion. As with the Iberians, according to M. Darbois de Jubanville, this red race of the Italian antiquary is assumed to have come into Europe out of the sunken island continent of Atlantis, which our grandfathers spoke of as the fabled Atlantis, but which the voyage of the Challenger and the study of geology have both proved to be no fable. The point of difference between scientific men now seems to be rather the probable date of the subsidence of that continent, which, it is contended by some, must be so remote as to preclude the possibility of establishing a race connection between the two continents in this way. But at any rate, there are several reasons for believing that the unidentified builders of our stone circles, cairns, and dolmens, were dark-skinned people, and the races with which they have most similarity are Professor Huxley's Australoid and Negritos. Not only is it asserted by him that there is an actual blood relationship between those two families and British people of this and past generations, plainly visible in many outward features, but there is also the testimony of similar customs, some of which will be afterwards specified. One of these is the practice of tattooing the body, and another is the kindred practice of painting or smearing it with various colours. But the most telling evidence is that afforded by the stone monuments, which are found in all the countries which have been inhabited by those races. Tasmania, home of the Negritos, has its stone circles and cairns, and Scotland shows the presence of the same people and the same works. In the Australoid Deccan there are dolmens and stone circles, as in the Australoid Britain and West Europe, and there is, within the jungle of one part of Borneo, a great area known to the Malays as Jalan Batoy, the Field of Stones. It contains rocking stones, standing stones, and others, and many of these are covered with marks resembling the curious picture writings found on scattered stones and rocks in British Guiana and other parts of South America. The present inhabitants know nothing of their origin, and believe them to be haunted by spirits, a memory, doubtless, of the time when their builders, a different race, lived among them. These, it may be reasonably presumed, were the Negritos now found in the islands to the southeast. The Negritos, although not identical with the Australoids, are yet said to present a remarkable approximation to the Australoid type, and the two divisions may logically be held to have been one in the days of the ancient Britons, though since modified by intermixture with other races. Accepting, therefore, the existence of Australoids and Mongoloids within these islands, as a fact which is likely to become more and more clearly established as time goes on. The object now set before us is to find out, if possible, whether there are any proofs of their presence as distinct races yet traceable in our own customs, language, and traditions. There ought to be such, if those races were really the ancestors of many among us. Desire Charney has lately told us, in the North American Review Octacour 1881, that the Toltecs, whom he believes to be the builders of the monuments of Mexico and Central America, were white men. Physically, he says, Wettier describes the Toltec as a man of tall stature, white and bearded, and he himself adds confirmatory evidence. I have in my possession a bas-relief found at Tula, coinciding very well with this description. The man is full face and has a large hooked nose, his beard being wide and fan-shaped. There are also apparent proofs of white blood among the American Indians of the present day, quite distinct from any results of the European invasions of the last few centuries. The eastern nations of Chile have but a slight ting of the brown colour, and the Borouanis are still whiter. On the northwest coast, from latitude 430 to 6 there are tribes who, though embrowned with soot and mud, were found, when their skins were washed, to have the brilliant white and red which is the characteristic of the Caucasian race. Within the tropics, the Malapocs in Brazil, the Guaranis in Paraguay, the Guiancas of Guyana, the Xeres of La Plata, have tolerably fair complexions, sometimes united with blue eyes and auburn hair, and in the hot country washed by the Orinoco, Humboldt found tribes of a dark and others of a light hue living almost in juxtaposition. And the Shawnees, or Shawanos, who formerly inhabited West Florida, of which country they did not believe their ancestors to be the Aborigines, have, or used to have, a belief that Florida had once been inhabited by white people who had the use of iron tools. Blackhoof affirms, and this was in 1819, 65 years after he and his tribe had left Florida, that he has often heard it spoken of by old people, that stumps of trees covered with earth were frequently found, which had been cut down by edged tools. And Major Serpa Pinto has lately encountered in Africa a race of white Hottentots, hideous beyond belief, like caricatured Mongolians, and evidently lower even than the Fuegians of South America in the scale of humanity. And even in the South Seas there is the tradition of a white race, now remembered as supernatural beings. Their appearance is that of human beings nearly resembling a European's, their hair being very fair, and so is their skin. It must be remembered, however, that traditions are not always so old as they are often hastily assumed to be. The Polynesian fairies might be Europeans of only last century, and the whites of Florida were perhaps, and indeed probably, the Spaniards and French of the 16th century. So also may the various white Indians be descendants of the comrades of Drake and Raleigh, or they may descend from immigrants who antedate even Columbus by centuries. The date of the calm discovery gas of America to non-Americans is every now and then pushed farther back. The claim of Columbus has long ago yielded to that of the Norsemen, and they in turn have given place to some Buddhist priests from China, who reached Mexico in the 5th century. There is a theory that the Phoenicians colonized Florida at an earlier period still. But this has two readings. If the Phoenicians were white men, they may have been the traditionary whites of the Shawnees. If they were, as Signor Generelli suggests, a copper-coloured race, then they were likely the progenitors of the Shawnees themselves, who assert that their forefathers were not indigenous, but came across the ocean, from whence they know not, in memory of which event they continued to celebrate a yearly sacrifice for their safe arrival in America, up till the beginning of the present century. J. Another such colonization is that of the Welsh under Prince Madoc in the year 1170, of which there is the distinct tradition upon this side of the Atlantic, and some curious and corroborative facts upon the other side. Whether this was really another migration than that of the Shawnees may be doubted. For the age of the Shawnee tradition is quite uncertain, and their eastern forefathers may either have been early Phoenicians or later Welsh. And the question of complexion need be no obstacle to this last hypothesis, until it is proved that Madoc and his followers were white men. All of these facts and semi-facts point, with more or less distinctness, to remote folk wanderings and of various races, and they seem to suggest, what indeed? Comparative ethnology asserts, that movements almost or altogether as extensive as the modern branching out of the British people over all the globe have taken place in distant, unrecorded periods, not wholly unrecorded either, until the places named in such ancient records as those of the Hebrews and the Chinese have been fairly identified and translated into modern speech. We cannot say that such remote colonizations have never been placed upon record. Whatever be the origin of the zanthocroid, whether they migrated westward in almost historic times, or whether they were gradually evolved from lower forms within the precincts of their present home, it seems agreed by men of learning that among the earliest inhabitants of these islands were the troglodytes, or cave-dwellers, known later by such titles as Australoid, Mongoloids, and, historically, Iberians or Euskarians. As separate types, these have, in successive epochs, ceased to exist, but from this stock, or one of these stocks, have come the modern melanochroi, and in these melanochroi most of us are bound to take an interest, for it has been decided by an eminent authority that in modern Britain the dark type of humanity now distinctly preponderates over the light type. This fact therefore compels the majority of us to regard those depraved Australoid AEC, whose skulls still bear witness to their depravity, as in some measure our lineal ancestors, that is, if the supposed derivation of the dark white from the Australoid be correct. The two great divisions of Professor Huxley are so closely intermingled that it can scarcely be invidious to dwell upon the disagreeable features of this line of the dark white ancestry. For the two types, in a vast number of cases, find representatives under one family roof, so that you shall see the rosy-cheeked, blue-eyed, golden-haired sister and the dark-skinned, black-haired, dark-eyed brother playing amicably side by side. The types are not extinct, but they are represented by the one united people. Besides, although it is proposed in these pages to ascertain if haply there may be any good reasons for believing that the British Australoid were as swarthy as any other branches of that family, yet even to prove this would do nothing to prove that the clear-skinned, fair whites had not an equally humble lineage. The abject and hideous race of Hottentots encountered by Sir Pinto were white-skinned men, and he assigned them the very lowest place in the scale of humanity. And, at any rate, if the theory of evolution be a true one, it is evident that the origin of all the human families must unquestionably be humble, whether white or black. Further, the incidental feature of complexion is of little importance ethnologically, since it is the anatomical construction that determines the rank of the being, human or otherwise. Not only are the two types closely intermingled as to colour, but the irregular and less pleasing characteristics of the Australoid may be easily detected even in families whose complexion would, of itself, proclaim them to be pure zanthocroid. We have all a pretty fair idea of the kind of face belonging to this latter division. A perfect specimen of it is such as the painters give to Adam or to the angels, and such a face is exquisitely handsome. But many who seem at first to belong exclusively to this division cannot undergo successfully a closer scrutiny. One has the coarse and flexible mouth of the Australoid, another shows his kinship to that race in the formation of his upper jaw, or in the shape and size of his teeth, while a third has the short flat nose of the Mongoloid and the Australoid. The hair, though light in colour, may be as crisp and curly as a Negro's, and other race signs alien to the purest fair white may be visible in the natural growth of the beard, or in its scantiness, or its total absence. All of these marks may be detected among men who, at the first glance, appear to be xanthochroid, and they proclaim a mixed lineage quite as indisputably as does a tawny complexion or raven hair. You may see faces of a distinctly Mongolian and even of a Negroid cast in families whose pedigree may be traced for many generations without disclosing the slightest hint of extra British blood. It may be only in the structure of the head and jaw, the complexion being clear red and white, and the eyes blue, or it may be in structure and complexion both that this resemblance is visible. Since, therefore, the least handsome of the physical attributes of our heterogeneous nation are shared in some degree by the most of its members, there can be little fault in specifying particular localities and their inhabitants where it may be convenient to do so. Indeed, this has been done over and over again. Thackeray, for example, notices the flat Tartar faces and squat figures of the southwestern Irish. A recent writer dwells upon the fact that in certain districts of England, where the names of the towns and villages show that the Saxon and Danish conquerors occupied the country in overwhelming numbers, the descendants of a race not unlike the modern Eskimo are still found. The Hebrideans, who will be referred to more particularly, are described by another writer as being very Mongolian in feature, and indeed the prominent cheekbones that form a most striking feature of the Mongoloid are regarded by many as the attribute of every Scotch man. But, as that word is often loosely used to designate any native of Scotland, of whatever lineage, this feature need only be the property of certain Scottish tribes. So far as complexion goes, there can be no doubt as to the presence of a vast infusion of coloured blood. There are, of course, no living Britons who are as black as Negroes, but some are as dark as mulattoes, and many darker than Chinamen. To regard ourselves in the mass as white people, except in a comparative degree, is quite a mistake. This varied ancestry connects us, therefore, with almost every nation under the sun. And as we have inherited the blood that is akin to that of many savage races now alive, it is only logical to infer that any customs, or it may be words common to us and to them, have come down to each of us from the same original.